My name is Sara Tiffany. I'm the Director of Ecological Farming with the Community Alliance of Family Farmers, CAFF, and want to warmly welcome you all to the 33rd Annual California Small Farm Conference. If you are looking for the session titled Let's Talk About Carbon Sequestration, you are in the right place. With some very enthusiastic soil science and farming nerds at your service here. So we're going to dive in just a few minutes, but just a couple housekeeping items. So first of all, we really want this to be, I know it's hard to do virtually, but we really do want it to be an interactive session. So please, throughout the discussion and the presentation, please drop your questions in the Q&A. And if you can reserve any questions that are specific to logistics or technology, go ahead and put those in the chat. And that way we can help sort the questions as they come in and hopefully get to all of them. And so feel free to just go ahead and populate that Q&A box, and we will have a couple folks, Emily and Rose, behind the scenes that are going to help us sort of organize the questions. We did end up turning this into a webinar rather than a meeting because there were so many people signed up, and just logistically wanted to make it go a little smoother. So that's what's going on there. And just a reminder, we are recording all of our workshops for the Small Farm Conference, and they will be available on CAFF's YouTube channel. And there will be links and information shared in a follow-up email. So basically, if you're here and registered for this session, you will receive a follow-up email. I believe that will also contain an evaluation. If you want to give us any comments or feedback, that would be wonderful. Again, if you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're coming from. If, as we kind of go through this topic, you have relevant resources and comments, please share that with with the rest of us. We would love to hear. And yeah, I think with that, we'll just get started. Again, please go ahead and drop your questions and comments in the Q&A box as we go along, and any questions about tech in the chat box. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. This topic, I think, is a very important one to explore. Carbon sequestration is getting a whole lot of attention. It has been for a number of years now, but there does seem to be, we seem to be in a moment of some sort of amplification. And so we really felt like it would be a great idea to dig into some of the nuance about carbon sequestration from the scientific perspective, and just kind of explore and widen the conversation a little bit about carbon. So I, again, am Sara Tiffany. I'm with CAFF. I'm the Director of Ecological Farming, and my background is in sustainable agriculture in general and soil science. And I'm going to have my fellow panelists introduce themselves. Tim, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Sara. Wonderful to be here with you all today, seeing all of the amazing places you're coming from, lots of different types of farmers and ranchers here with us, so really excited to see you all. So my name is Tim Bowles. I'm an assistant professor of agroecology at UC Berkeley. And a lot of my work is really at the intersection of kind of ecological approaches to farming and soil science. I work mainly in California, particularly in vegetable systems, both for instance, tomatoes up in the Sacramento Valley, but also down in cool season vegetables in the Central Coast. So yeah, excited to share this hour with you all.
Thanks, Tim. Jessica, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I guess I'll start by echoing Tim and Sara's gratitude to you all for being here with us today. My name is Jessica Chartis. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis in soils and biogeochemistry. My research mostly focuses on the long-term impacts of agriculture on soil carbon and soil health. And I guess a unique point there is that I'm really interested in deep soil carbon. I've been fortunate to be involved in some long-term research at UC Davis at Russell Ranch, looking at the change between 1993 and 2012 down to a depth of 2 meters. And that kind of got me curious about just what stocks are like across the state and what our potential is for kind of shifting that lever. So I've been fortunate to work with a lot of great groups like Fibershed, White Buffalo Land Trust, doing some more of that monitoring and evaluation work across the state. And yeah, I look forward to sharing more with you all here today.
Great, thanks, Jess. And just to give you guys, an idea here of what our plan is, we're going to kick things off with putting Tim in the hot seat. He's going to give us the quick and dirty on soil carbon and carbon sequestration, and sort of just so we can all get on the same page about the major scientific processes that are underlying there. From there, we're going to go into sort of a guided discussion among the three of us. And after that, we're really hoping that we're going to have quite a few questions and comments from the audience here. So please go ahead and populate that Q&A box as we go along. And with that, I want to invite Tim. Do you want to go ahead and share your slides?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We can hope everybody can see this now. So our goal in getting us started here is really to give us kind of a shared foundation on which to have a discussion. And I know we're all coming from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different approaches to knowledge and knowing. And so here we want to just kind of get us on kind of a baseline of like, what is some of the science around carbon sequestration from kind of a big picture? What are some of the uncertainties and challenges associated with using carbon sequestration as a tool for dealing with climate change? So this isn't meant to go into a great deal of depth and specificity, but it's really meant to just give us a shared vocabulary on which to build that we can then kind of specify and complicate for our particular situations here in California. So I want to get started by just showing, why a lot of us probably care about this iconic image of climate change, showing increasing carbon dioxide concentrations from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And right now we're at 415 parts per million. I had the same slide from a presentation in February 2020. We were at 414 then, which actually is not as big of an annual increase as we've been seeing thanks to COVID. But still, we're still going up. And if we look at where we've come from over the last several hundred years, we've put in a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or other greenhouse gases. If you look at just the land use, all the carbon that has been emitted from land as humans have converted ecosystems into agriculture, it's about 137 petagrams of carbon. Now, it's hard to imagine what a petagram is, but if you had a block of water that was 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, big, huge block of water, that would weigh about 1 petagram. So we're talking about quite a bit of carbon, of course, that we've emitted into the atmosphere. And if we want to deal with the effects of climate change, we have to not only reduce these emissions, but we also now have to start talking about so-called negative emissions. That is actually not just reducing the emissions that we're putting in, but actually taking those emissions out. And we have to do that if we want to prevent what climate scientists tell us would be catastrophic warming over about 2 degrees Celsius over the historical record. And of course, that brings us to carbon. And why carbon? So if we look at the really, really big picture of just where is the carbon in the world, well, it might surprise you, or maybe it doesn't, but that soil actually has a lot more carbon than the atmosphere does, almost 3 times as much more carbon, and actually more carbon than all of the plant and animal biomass that exists on the world. And so if we see about 2,400 petagrams of carbon in the soil, and about as much as half or 3/4 of that is below the bottom foot. And so this is in this incredibly important quantity of carbon that we're talking about in soils. And this was brought to the attention of a lot of people, a lot of policymakers and others around the world after the Paris climate talks a few years ago, when some folks put together this idea of using carbon, and this wasn't a new idea, but it was one that they popularized at this point, but of using soil carbon as this means for negative emissions. That is, if we can take atmospheric carbon dioxide, store it in soil in a stable way, then we could actually offset a lot of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted. And so just some simple arithmetic here, if you take the amount of carbon that we have stored already in soils worldwide, and you take 0.4% of that, well, that's about equal to the quantity of greenhouse gases that humans are emitting annually. So this has been called the 4 per mil initiative, or 0.4% initiative. If we can increase global carbon stocks by 0.4% per year, we could completely offset climate change. Now, of course, it's not that simple, but at least it gives us this starting point for why this is such an important topic. And if we're going to talk about soil carbon, well, we have to think about what that is. And a lot of us may think of this in terms of soil organic matter, and soil carbon is part of soil organic matter. You know, we can think of soil organic matter as the relic of every living thing that has ever entered soil, every root, all the leaves, all the crop residues, the animals, the poop, everything that has come into soil, been transformed. And it's also the basis for soil life. And so if we look at all of the elements, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur that makes up organic matter, 58% of that on average is carbon. And we also know that it's very easy to lose this and can be quite hard to restore. And then I think that's our mission today, is think how can we go about restoring that in a stable way? What are some of the challenges? And so this gets at whether soil carbon is a so-called source or a sink, right? So this is some of that shared vocabulary that I wanted to help us develop. So if we think of soil carbon as a sink, that means that the carbon coming into soil is more than the carbon leaving soil. So for instance, the main process for getting carbon into soils is through plants, right? Through photosynthesis. So if the amount of carbon coming in through plants and photosynthesis exceeds the carbon that's being lost by respiration, by decomposition, then that would be a carbon sink. On the other hand, if those processes that cause carbon to leave soil are greater than things like photosynthesis, then we have a source of carbon that's actually contributing to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So I want us to just think a bit like an ecosystem ecologist. And as an ecosystem ecologist, and this is one of the ways that I identify, we think about, you're really a glorified accountant in a lot of ways. You're thinking about credits, debits, and stocks. So when we think about carbon inputs, we're thinking about our credits, right? We're thinking about what's coming into this bank of soil carbon. And when we're thinking about outputs, we're thinking about the debits, what's going out of this bank of soil carbon. So just pause, let's pause for just a second. And I can't see the chat, so I'm hoping that Sara might be able to help me out. If folks could share some ideas about what are some of the fluxes of carbon? What are some of the inputs of carbon that you could imagine happening in this rangeland ecosystem here? And I can see if I can find the chat in the meantime. But if Sara sees any good, maybe you can read them out to me.
I'll let you know, Tim. I'm watching it.
Okay.
More grass,
More
manure.
Right. Yeah. So grass. So of course, plants photosynthesizing is the main way. I mean, this is clearly a summertime here. You know, where things have senesced, but plants are the conduit for carbon into this system. That's manure. Manure, as we'll see, can get a little complicated because we can think of that as this recycling of carbon in the ecosystem, since the cows are eating grass and then they're pooping. But plants are what's bringing this in. Any other ideas?
We've got root exudates.
There we go. Yeah, another star role for plants. We could think about erosion. If there were, say, if there were soil being eroded off this hillside, that could actually count as a carbon input. And what about the outputs? What about the debits from this system? What is causing carbon to go out of this system? Any ideas?
I think someone's mentioned tillage here. We see bare ground. We see methane.
Right. So methane from the cows. If this rangeland were tilled for some reason, that would certainly stimulate decomposition and microbial activity, lead to carbon leaving. So we could also think about the animals themselves being taken away, exported out of this rangeland ecosystem because they formed from carbon from the grass that they ate. So lots of different ways that carbon comes in and out of. So this gets at kind of a really simple and, to be honest, overly simplified but useful way of thinking about the how much soil organic matter, how much soil carbon exists in a particular field, rangeland system, wherever we decide to kind of draw the boundaries of what we're talking about, right? So we're thinking about this in terms of, can we get more carbon in than carbon out, right? That's what we want. We want this to be a carbon sink. So for instance, planting cover crops, right? Having crops exist, having plants exist in the time of year when there would otherwise be bare soil clearly leads to more carbon in because we have these roots that are creating exudates. So we have the residues from those cover crops. Those cover crops can reduce soil erosion and reduce the amount of carbon that's leaving. We could think about reduced tillage and reducing tillage intensity, of course, and reducing microbial decomposition of organic matter. We could think about residue retention, reducing the amount of carbon lost. We think about perennial crops and how they tend to have much deeper roots than annual crops, thus getting those root exudates and that carbon deeper into the soil. And we could think about this more complex example, things like compost additions or manure additions of things like biochar. And the reason this is a slightly more complex example, at least from the standpoint of climate change mitigation, is because this represents a transfer of carbon from one place to another. And so, for instance, green waste compost coming from municipality that's then being transferred into a crop system. And so while it might increase soil carbon, we don't know without more information whether that's actually leading to a net reduction in greenhouse gases. We can talk about that a little bit more. So a slightly more nuanced view of what is going on here, what building soil organic matter is all about. Well, it all comes back to the microbes, because now we know that actually most of soil organic matter is dead microbes. That's pretty cool. So we know that we actually have to be feeding microbes in order to be building soil organic matter, because it is literally their bodies that after they've died that are glomming on to the minerals in soil and building soil organic matter. And so we can actually see this really cool image. This is something called electron microscopy that allows us to zoom in on this big honking piece of clay mineral right here. And then in this kind of false color image, we see kind of dead bacteria that have kind of glommed onto the surface here. All right, so then we want to bring up just a few challenges. Well, first thing that we want to mention is that if we're talking about carbon stocks, we have to think about the difference between just measuring the amount of carbon in soil and actually calculating a stock. So if you go around, you collect samples for a soil test, you send it off to a lab, what you're going to get back is a concentration of soil organic matter. In order to actually convert that into an amount per unit area, we need something called bulk density. That is basically the mass per unit volume of the soil. And so that's an additional measurement. This is often done with these kind of cylinders right here, where you take a known volume, you stick that into the soil, and you measure the mass of that soil that you get out in this known volume. So if we're talking about stocks, we also need to think about bulk density. Another challenge, that is that soils can't store unlimited amounts of carbon. They reach what's called a saturation point. That is, if you were to look at a graph, and this is just a simple kind of cartoon graph of the amount of soil carbon over time, let's say you had a change in management. You started planting cover crops. Well, that increases your carbon inputs relative to the losses. And so you might see an increase in soil carbon content over time until it reaches kind of a new level where the inputs and outputs are now equal to one another. That level is a function of a lot of different factors, but part of it is about just inherent soil properties, things like the texture and mineralogy of your soil. And so this is not what we're talking about when we talk about soil carbon sequestration, is just this linear increase over time in perpetuity. Most soils have a limited capacity to store carbon given a certain type of management. Another challenge, and this is especially true when we think about how do we actually validate changes in soil carbon sequestration, is how do we even measure it? So if you took the average, and this is really variable, but just a number that we can use as a straw person here, amount of soil carbon in California rangeland down to 1 meter depth, that would be about 140 megagrams of carbon per hectare. Well, a reasonable increase in soil carbon might be maybe 0.1 or on a really high end, 1.5 megagrams per carbon per hectare per year. All right, so if you think about that, we're talking about maybe 1/1000th or 1/100th increase in soil carbon every year. That's really hard to measure. So we have a big signal to noise issue here in terms of measuring, and soils are notoriously heterogeneous. And for those of you, and many of us probably have, been out digging or trying to take an auger in a rangeland, especially on if you're trying to do it in the summer or bad times of year, this is really laborious. And so this is why models like the Comet Farm Planner are used to project changes in soil carbon stocks rather than measuring it directly. A couple other challenges I'll just mention briefly. One is reversibility. So for an increase in soil carbon stocks to really contribute in the long term to greenhouse gas mitigation, it has to actually stay in the soil. So what happens if that reverses? And of course, this is an issue with a lot of different offset schemes. If you plant trees and then cut them down, well, that's not a permanent removal of carbon. Another issue is that agricultural management, including things that can increase soil carbon, can also affect other powerful greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. So if we're thinking about climate change mitigation, not just changing soil carbon, we have to also take these other greenhouse gases into account. One major uncertainty is actually what happens with warming. So as temperatures warm from global climate change, soil microbes are going to become more active on average. That means that they're going to be doing more decomposition, which could actually lead to less carbon in the soil. But on the other hand, warming also can increase plant activity, which can increase carbon in soil. And so both of these together can be really hard to predict the outcome of. And then just the last uncertainty that I want to raise, this is probably front and center for many of you, is actually what happens when we develop markets for things like soil carbon sequestration. In the US, as a nation, and also in California in particular, over the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of investment from hedge funds and other institutional investors using farmland as a means of accruing interest. And now, as we think about paying for carbon sequestration, will this lead to more investment and have unexpected impacts on things like land access and land tenure and the value of farmland? All of this being said, all of these uncertainties and challenges that I've raised, we also have to put in the context of co-benefits, right? We ideally can help mitigate climate change, but building soil carbon, as many of us are likely aware, also comes with a lot of co-benefits. It can actually help build climate resilience by increasing the ability of soil's ability to intercept and store water, by increasing the number of beneficial microbes. All of these different functions that farmers and ranchers are relying on for soil. So we also have to put this carbon sequestration conversation in the context of these broader co-benefits. So I know this was a whirlwind, and I hope that we can kind of unpack a lot of these issues and make them a little bit closer to home during our conversation. So,
Thank you so much, Tim, for giving us that whirlwind tour. There's a couple notes. We did go through it really fast, but looking again, just to kind of lay a foundation, and you know, some great points were made in the chat that I think we're going to be able to dig into a little bit. And just a reminder, as you guys have questions and answers, please, or well, share your answers too, absolutely. There's a Q&A box on the bottom right of your screen, so go ahead and drop those in. So I think after hearing that that presentation, Tim, I thought you framed it really well, particularly in terms of some of the challenges. And I think this is something that comes up a lot. And you know, considering the, you know, the talk about, you know, the role of carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation in particular, you know, I think your challenges touched on sort of the limitations to that, but wondering if we could dig in just a little bit there to that limitation, maybe almost taking that first challenge as an example. And I'm wondering if you all could share examples of where we see, you know, limitations to carbon sequestration on farms and in the research in general, if we could give some examples of that. And I know that a number of folks have, I think there's a lot of curiosity about the role of the microbiology in the soil when it comes to that. So if either of you would love to take a stab at that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Jess, why don't you get started, since I've been talking for too long, probably.
Thanks, Tim. I think this is a great question. I think there's still a lot that we don't know here, but just kind of I guess to reference a little bit from the research that we did at Russell Ranch at the long-term experiment there. We had, you know, a cover crop system that received mineral fertilizer, and we had a cover crop system that received compost. And when you contrast those two systems, you know, we don't know exactly the mechanics of what was going on, but it does kind of raise the question of whether there was something about the compost addition that was able to override some sort of limitation in the system, because, and I wish I had an image to share with you all, but the compost plus cover crop system sequestered, you know, I think something like 21 megagrams of carbon per hectare to a depth of 2 meters. Whereas the cover crop plus mineral fertilizer actually lost about 4.8 megagrams of carbon per hectare. And to be fair, at depth, you know, it's challenging. again, one of the limitations here on the monitoring side is it's challenging to get enough samples to really overcome that signal to noise ratio Tim talked about, and so to get statistical significance, which we like to see in science. But the trends in the compost system were quite strong, showing increases down to depth that were, largely outweighing what we saw in the cover crop plus mineral fertilizer. And so to circle back to what I mentioned about the limitations potentially there, oh, thank you, Tim, is that, compost is this suite of, it's a carbon matrix with this suite of plant essential nutrients within it, right? So it's not just carbon and nitrogen going into the system in the cover crop system plus mineral fertilizer, but it's nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, magnesium. And so kind of makes us wonder if there was some sort of either macro or micronutrient deficiency in the cover crop plus mineral fertilizer system that could have led to what's called a priming effect. So the idea being that you're giving all this fresh, easy to assimilate food and carbon to microbes, you're building up this population of microbes that they need other nutrients to build their bodies or to make enzymes to do the work that they do. And in order to get those nutrients, if they don't have them easily accessible, the idea is that they may be going into old organic matter and consuming that to release those nutrients and make them available. Whereas potentially in the cover crop plus compost system, we've been able to override some sort of limitation. This actually relates to some research that was done in Australia that showed that, I think it was something like 50 years that they were adding residues into the system to try to boost carbon, and it was just flatlining. There was no increase. And then they fertilized actually with nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur in a ratio that was relevant to microbial biomass and what they need to build their bodies. And immediately they started to see increases in soil organic matter. So just thinking about the fact that, if microbes don't have access to the nutrients they need, they're going to have to do work, or they're going to have to go into old organic matter, stable organic matter to make that available. I guess another thing to talk about regarding limitations would just be kind of what Tim touched on about, this saturation point. If there's not a lot of clay or mineral surfaces for that carbon to bind onto, it may remain available for microbes to eventually decompose and put back into CO2. There are some thoughts though about that are kind of questioning that. There's been some work that's shown that when you hit that saturation level on the surface, which is where we've typically always looked, you actually get a desorption of old organic matter that can move downward then. It solubilizes into water and can move down deeper into the profile. And so this is kind of also why I'm interested in depth, because, everything we've looked at around carbon saturation has been in the surface. And it's kind of still a remaining question of whether that there is a limit in the surface, but once you hit that, could that carbon then start to kind of leak more downward? I'll stop there, and Sarah and Tim, if you have other limitations you want to touch on.
There was just, I know I put this up kind of after you started talking about it, but there was a request that if you would just explain a little bit about the figure here that you had, I think, started talking about, and maybe define the different types of systems a little bit.
Sorry, I muted myself prematurely. Yes, so what you see here on the left is the carbon concentrations. And this is actually the change over time from 1993 to 2012. And so this actually kind of shows a little bit about what Tim was talking about with the bulk density to get to stocks. The concentrations here on the left are what you would get out of the test. It's a % of carbon in each sample at each depth from 0 to 15. So we have conventional at the top, which is just conventionally managed mineral fertilizers, bare fallow during the winter. The next bar is conventional plus a winter cover crop. So it receives a cover crop every winter and is supplemented with mineral fertilizer as needed. And then the next bar being organic, which is completely organic certified, managed as such. So that's another, question in here, is whether or not there's some element of the organic management that's playing a role, the lack of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. But also importantly received compost and a winter cover crop annually. And so you're seeing that percentage at each depth down to 2 meters. And then the last sort of chunk we have here is the whole profile. So it's taking an average across the 0 to 200 centimeters. On the right side, this is basically, we've taken that percent concentration, we've multiplied it by the bulk density, which again is also a big source of variability. And typically the way we've monitored in the past, we've only taken maybe one bulk density sample for a whole acre, for instance, which is, which can be limiting as well in terms of you're multiplying this concentration by the bulk density to get to the stocks. And it's kind of magnifying the source of error because of variability. But what we get here at carbon stocks is that total amount of carbon in each depth. And again, you're seeing the conventional plus cover crop and organic. And so as you see, it becomes a lot more variable with depth. And so again, that's where there's still a lot of questions to be answered around what's happening at depth. And the reason I'm so interested in depth is because if we're talking about climate change mitigation, whether or not a given acre is a source or a sink of CO2 is going to depend on the whole system, not just the surface 30 centimeters. And more we're seeing that management can impact depth both in ways that increase carbon over the long term and that create a loss of carbon. So.
And I might just on that point, Jess, ask you to expand a little bit on the depth question. And I think it's important to note that a lot of the research that's been done thus far in our cropping systems looking at carbon haven't necessarily gone below the root zone very far. So could you guys, I know we've certainly seen that in our own research, the carbon moving down through the soil profile or not moving down, depending on the land management. Could you guys talk a little bit about what you've seen there? I know you just talked about it, Jess, but I'm just wondering if you guys could talk about sort of, like where do we sit in terms of the research actually starting to address that importance of looking at carbon and other the other nutrients that are involved in carbon sequestration further down in the soil.
Yeah,
Tim,
I think
do you
we're.
want to give it a go first? Oh, there you go.
Sure. Yeah, I think we're, just beginning to appreciate how important that is. And the study that Jess references is one of the more complete ones on that, particularly in California. But we've seen in our own research, and including research that Sarah's been involved with on kind of small scale biointensive no-till systems where you're not, they're no-till systems, you're not mixing the soil and you're applying a lot of compost to the surface, but we're seeing carbon accumulate even down below the first foot of soil. We'd measure down to about 50 centimeters, which is almost 2 feet, not quite 2 feet. And we see some carbon even beginning to accumulate down there. And that's, that's because of a number of things. Well, one is, of course, roots are going very deep into soil. And those roots are one of the primary, basically pipes for carbon into soil. So the carbon is going to be appearing even as far down as roots go. Also, even if you're using something that we think of as kind of this like stabilized organic matter like carbon, there's still going to be decomposition happening and it's going to become soluble. Some of it is going to become dissolved in water that can then move down into the soil profile. And so, this is, and there's also other processes that can get it down deep. And so I think it is a laborious, hard thing to do to measure with any depth, but it's absolutely critical because if we just look at the surface, we may actually miss the full story. We may actually not only miss opportunities, but we may also miss vulnerabilities. Like that is, we may actually see that if we look at the whole top 3 feet or more, that the story switches from being one of a carbon sink to a carbon source, or vice versa. So it's really important that we get this depth story correct.
Thank you,
I just
Tim.
can I add one more thing there, Sarah?
Go ahead, please.
I think that the easy thing to do would probably be to look at this depth question and kind of throw our hands up, because, you know, just to reference another long-term experiment, and on behalf of Jeff Mitchell, who's not here today, but Jeff Mitchell is a UC cooperative extension agent that's done some research on no-till cover crop systems at 5 points in the Central Valley. Very hot, dry system, hard to sequester carbon in. But you know, they've looked down to a meter as well, and you know, again, variability was kind of just all over the place, and they weren't able to see any significant trends over, I believe, almost a 20-year period as well. Maybe it was 15 years. And so the easy thing to do would be to throw our hands up and say, you know, we don't know enough. And now, like Tim and Sarah both mentioned, you know, all the research in the past has been to an average of about 25 centimeters. And so what do we do then? You know, do we just say, okay, well, we don't incentivize things that are going to sequester carbon because, you know, it may not be a greenhouse gas or sink, and it may be a source. And I think that brings us to another important point that circles back to what Tim mentioned about the co-benefits. Because if we're still seeing improvements in, I think, well, two things. One, I think this stresses the importance of considering the co-benefits as we're looking at incentive programs, because, you know, there may be folks who are doing really good work and improving functionality in their landscape and not able to increase their soil carbon over time. And conversely, there may be folks who are sequestering carbon and maybe they're having other, you know, negative impacts on the ecosystem. And so I think it's important to have a more holistic perspective. And I think this is something that's still very much within the realm of research, and we need to have, you know, maybe a network of sites where we're probing deeper and we're able to kind of like feed into models so that we can improve them. But in the meantime, I think this is the importance of not rushing too strongly into carbon markets alone and not considering the co-benefits, because it could exacerbate inequities. It could incentivize the wrong behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jess. And just to follow up, there's a couple specific questions referring to the Comet planner model and the data that informs that model. Do we know to what depth that carbon data is based on in the formulation of the model? Do you know specifically, Jess?
I'm not exactly sure, but I do believe it's something like 30 centimeters. Tim, I'm not sure if, I don't know the model that you referenced specifically, but I think Comet typically is about 30 centimeters.
Yeah, that I put it in the chat. I think that the management impacts in Comet are focused on the top 30 centimeters, but I definitely could be wrong about that. So if anybody in the audience knows, please pipe up, or we could get back to you.
Yeah, and I think it's also, again, it's a legacy of the body of research that we have is mostly focused on that top 30 centimeters, right? So again, I think there's an opportunity to go beyond that in the science, but let's actually take a step back just briefly, because I think, you know, there's some recognition here that that it's not necessarily all about carbon when we're talking about you know, building resilience and adaptation to climate change, but also mitigation. So, you know, there's a whole lot of focus on carbon, but could you guys talk about some of the other opportunities and strategies related to our agricultural systems and practices that are actually also part of this story?
Are you thinking specifically around reducing greenhouse gases, or around kind of what are some of the co-benefits?
I'm sure, I mean both, but yeah, let's go with reducing greenhouse gases to start. And I know that you know, how about we use an example? So there's been some questions in the chat about about bringing cattle onto land. And I think it elicits that conversation around inputs versus outputs, one. And I think it also brings into the picture that there are other greenhouse gases that we need to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the biggest emitters aside from carbon dioxide from agriculture is nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide, as many of you are probably aware, is mostly a function of synthetic fertilizer use, but also it can be emitted from systems, from organic agricultural systems as well. And so one of the neat things that we have found through some of my own research back when I was at UC Davis was thinking about that link between building up soil organic matter and kind of nitrogen management. And I'll try to keep this brief, but basically what we found, we did kind of research on about a dozen organic vegetable farms up near Davis, and found that if you looked at all of these farms for a number of reasons, both because of the soils that they were on and the history of management, they formed this gradient of soil organic matter. And the farms that had the highest organic matter had the lowest amount of available nitrogen in the soil. Now that may sound like a bad thing, but when we actually looked at the crops and the amount of nitrogen that they had available, they did not appear to be nitrogen limited at all. In fact, they were producing very good yields. So what had happened, I think, or what we think, was that as soil organic matter built up, the nutrient cycling capacity of the soil built up in tandem with that as a result of that. But that the forms of nitrogen that end up leading to nitrous oxide production weren't becoming very prevalent in the soil. And so while we didn't measure it directly, and that is something we need to do, what all of this points to is that as you can build soil organic matter and you can build up that co-benefit of nutrient cycling and nutrient retention in the soil, it might also promote better kind of nitrogen outcomes. It might also reduce the amount of of nitrous oxide that's being produced. So I think that's one of these critical linkages that's both a co-benefit and also this link with other greenhouse gas emissions, is how we think about soil organic matter and its relationship to nitrogen. So that's just one thing that comes to mind, Sara.
Thanks, Tim. And I think both of you have touched on some of these co-benefits, and I think it's really important that we do address that, because a lot of the conversation I think has centered around, okay, how do we do all of these regenerative farming practices and build up soil carbon so that we can effectively reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, otherwise known as drawing it down, right? But a lot of farmers, particularly California farmers, are already they're already facing climate change every single season. There's increased droughts that are anticipated, flooding, wildfires, and I'd be really curious to hear a little bit about the co-benefits and how they actually potentially build not only mitigation but resiliency and adaptation into the challenges people are already facing.
I wouldn't mind just kind of following up on some of the things I've said from these long-term research sites that connects to that. For one, at Russell Ranch, I mentioned that there was a loss of carbon potentially, it wasn't significant, but there was a trend of a loss of carbon in the cover crop plus mineral fertilizer system. But if we look at both cover crop systems relative to the conventional system, and this is just from communications with Daniel Rath, who's the researcher on this part of the project, but there was a 10% increase in soil moisture content in those cover crop systems. So, commonly we hear this argument that if you cover crop, you have a root in the ground, that means that it's transpiring, right? There's water that's leaving the system through that plant. And so there's a lot of concerns about cover cropping that it might use up the pool of water that the grower is hoping is going to be there for their next crop. And so this is actually kind of flipping that on its head. And I actually believe that Jeff Mitchell's work has similarly shown that there's more water infiltrating the system and potentially more water in the soils out there from doing this cover crop no-till system. And so, not only does water, carry a greenhouse gas footprint from pumping it, but it's also, if we're thinking about climate resilience, really important to get more water into the ground, collect every drop that lands. Also at Russell Ranch, we saw greater aggregate stability in the organic and the cover crop plus mineral fertilizer system, greater yield stability in the organic system over time. So there's a lot of, I think, increased microbial biomass and diversity. There's been a lot of other things that have been shown in these systems that are really important functionally to a grower. Yeah, and I think similarly at 5 points, even though there's been no real drastic increase in carbon at depth, they're showing better aggregate stability. And just by keeping roots in the ground and keeping the ground covered, Tim mentioned this earlier, but we're reducing erosion. And actually there was some work out of UC Merced from Asmer at Bayer that showed that that's actually a significant loss of carbon from the system, because when soil erodes, it's that carbon-rich topsoil that's making its way eventually potentially into waterways and eventually off-gassing back into the system. So just a few thoughts there.
Yeah, and I would just add, thank you for that, Jess. And I would just add that, what you just said, keeping the soil where it is and keeping one of the farmers I work with really loves to talk about keeping the rain where it falls. And that every single raindrop should have an address on it that's associated with it and then not leave, right? So, it's about building up soil carbon, but it's also about, building, like an agroecosystem that is in fact a system that is achieving more and more ecological function as you integrate these different practices. And one example would be that, it's shown in a number of systems that, if you're just doing cover crop and you're tilling that cover crop every single season, not to say that's not a positive practice to do if you're in an all tillage system, but if we combine that cover crop planting with no-till, for example, the impact of that cover crop ends up, having more of an impact on soil health than the cover crop plus the tillage in the long term. And then let's say you add in a layer of composting, adding compost back into that same field, adding compost and cover cropping and minimizing your tillage, you're affecting that input-output balance of carbon and nutrients in general. So one of the things that we really try to look at is, well, yes, certain practices can, be really great entry points to starting to think more critically about soil health on your farm. But ultimately, the more of a systems-based understanding that we have, the more effective we're going to be, because, when we're talking about any of these mechanisms, whether it's, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, nutrient cycling, these are all systems, right? So that's just an approach that we really lean on. I'll stop there.
Should we look to some of the questions that have come through the chat?
Yeah. Thanks, Tim.
Can I add one more fun fact while you pick a question from the Russell Ranch study? This is just something that I'm really interested in. The organic system also showed increases in nutrient density in the form of antioxidants and flavonoids in the tomatoes. And that's something that's like a fairly under-researched field, but some folks find that also interesting. Something that we often feel we can taste the difference. And that does connect back to those flavonoid, those compounds that we're seeing higher in those systems.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, and just noting the time, we only have about 6 minutes left. We have a ton of questions, and we've been trying to sort of address some of them as we go along. I'm going to just say that what we'll try to do after the session is I'll follow up with Tim and Jessica on trying to answer some of these other questions that we don't get to today. So I'm going to involunteer them both to help me with that. But let's get to some more specific questions that I think there's some really interesting questions here. Somebody asked about of cover cropping and crop rotation, and are there specific plants out there that farmers and ranchers can plant that are better at building up carbon than others in the soil? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I can take a first pass at it, and it's going to be a little bit generic, but we are in the middle of what's called a meta-analysis, which is looking at all of the studies that have been done all across the world on cover crops and how they affect soil carbon and crop yields. And so it's just kind of an average effect across all of these different situations. So we have to take it a little bit in that context. But what that's showing is that legumes legume cover crops are more effective at building soil carbon than non-legumes. And that makes a little bit of sense from what we know about kind of what microbes need to build their biomass. Of course, microbes are also involved in nitrogen fixation, so really important there too. And then deep-rooted cover crops as well would tend to be more effective. But I think with cover cropping, the main thing is about identifying the goal and designing that cover crop species or mix to fit that goal. And if carbon sequestration is the goal, then then you might narrow down to some options there.
Thanks, Tim. There's also been some questions about tillage, and I think this is always really important to address because farms are not a monolith. Farm practices are not a monolith. So I think, can we talk a little bit about tillage in relation to soil carbon? And, is it a black or white issue? Are you, do we need to put a judgment on tillage, or is there a different way to frame it?
I can at least share some thoughts on this. I definitely don't think we should be judging tillage too harshly. I think a lot of our no-till systems are based on herbicide use, and that's not a good thing either necessarily. Now, it has prevented a lot of erosion, these large-scale kind of herbicide-based no-till systems, but in our California vegetable systems, and it can be hard to eliminate tillage, particularly on organic production with weed challenges and other challenges. And so I know there's really cool research going on. Well, CAFF is sponsoring some with biointensive no-till, and Jeff Mitchell and others have an amazing group. Jessica's also involved in that. You could speak more to it, kind of trying to design methods for organic reduced or no-till systems, but it's hard. And I think what we learned is that, again, it's not that we don't see any benefits when you of soil carbon sequestration when you till. You still can see some benefits. Might be a little bit more limited than you would if you reduce tillage, but we also have to be realistic and about the constraints of different systems.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm actually going to just jump in here. This is really just not enough time to talk about this topic. And again, Jess and Tim and I will work on trying to address some questions on this. What we've done in past webinars is actually basically populated a Google Doc that's full of questions. So we can send that out to all of the attendees of this session. But we are going to have to wrap up here. And I just want to really thank everyone for attending this session. Again, there's never enough time to talk about this. And, it's been a joy to hear a little bit of the science that Tim and Jessica have been involved in and hear from you all. And, just briefly, in case we get kicked off, I do want to thank our sponsors and encourage you all to check out our virtual expo hall if you haven't done that. I think Evan has linked it in the chat. And also just a reminder, you know, this year it's been a crazy year with COVID, and CAFF is hosting the Small Farm Conference for free. So if you do have resources, consider donating to CAFF to support our conference if you're able to. And lastly, just a reminder that this recording is going to be available on YouTube, on CAFF's YouTube channel, and we will send that information afterwards in an email. And with that, I might just say, you know, ask if Tim and Jessica, if you want to add anything, if you have any great resources you want to point people towards, now would be a great time.
We'll send out the papers that we mentioned along with, we'll make sure, and also the slide deck, and also just thank you so much for your time and attention, and also mainly for all the amazing work that you're doing. I know there's a lot of amazing folks out there, so thank you.
Yeah, and I'll point folks actually to the CAFF website, where there's lots of great information on ecological farming and the benefits. I also, shameless plug, have a Instagram @soil.life, and try to share some easily digestible graphics and information about this sort of stuff. So also NRCS has some great resources, and UC Davis has a soil health website now as well that could provide some good information.
Thanks, Jess. And just to follow up on your plug, if you do go to the ecological farming program on the CAFF website, under each practice, there's actually a section that is titled, "What does the research say?" And it actually involves a deep review of the studies that have been done on cover crops and tillage and composting and hedgerows, et cetera, that we have worked very closely with Jessica on. So please check that out for your you know, soil science, wanting to understand how all of these things are actually happening in the soil. And just thank you again. We will be sending up a follow-up email and sending those resources along. And please do be in touch. Enjoy the conference. Consider becoming a member of CAFF. And yeah, thanks everyone. I don't know if we can stay on here, you guys, and just continue chatting for a bit. I'm waiting to hear no from someone, but I don't hear no. So are there any, you know, one question that came up a few times that I think always comes up, and it's an important one, is about livestock and greenhouse gases in livestock, and the question of, is there such a thing as carbon neutral beef, for example? That was one question we saw, and I'm curious how you guys would approach that.
Sounds like Tim has to jump, but maybe I can.
Okay.
I was gonna say you got to bring in Paige Stanley.
Well, I was just going to say, I'll send a link to, there's an amazing PhD candidate who's going to be finishing up this year in my lab, who studies this very thing, and but looking at sort of the whole life cycle analysis of grass-fed versus feedlot raised or feedlot finished beef in the Midwest, and is also looking at soil carbon stocks in adaptive multi-paddock grazing management systems in California. So I'll follow up with Sara with a link to a PDF of Paige's paper on that. But she's done some great work. And
That'd be great, Tim.
Yeah, also has a very
Thank
active Twitter account where she talks a lot about this stuff. So we'll make sure to send that out. But thanks everybody. I have to run.
All right, thanks, Tim. You take care.
Right.
Well, we probably should wrap it up here. So thank you, everyone. We will be sending those resources out to you, and continue enjoying the conference. And like I said, be in touch.